I've been arguing for a long time that Alberta needs to adapt more quickly to the energy transition and climate policy, which is being strengthened around the world by global governments. And that message isn't always well received in Alberta, the home of Canadian oil and gas industry. But Todd Hirsch, the chief economist of the ATB in Alberta, has written a very interesting column about the need for the Alberta economy to adapt to the new economic reality. And so we're going to talk to him about that. Welcome to the interview, Todd.
Thank you for having me.
Well, look, let's start out. Why don't you give our viewers an overview of the argument you made in your column today?
Yeah, well, when I was in Australia about a year ago, I was actually really nervous about driving on the left side of the road. I thought I could not wrap my head around how this was going to be possible. I tried mentally in my head ahead of time to visualize this. But what actually happened is when I got to Australia and eventually had to take the wheel, adapting to the new system was not nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be. The bigger challenge or the bigger fear was really the anticipation of changing. It wasn't changing itself. So I thought there's some parallels to where we're at here in Alberta. I know there is a lot of nostalgia for getting back to the good old days, getting back on track, a lot of that sort of language. But I can't help but feel as long as we're trapped in that language of getting back to where we used to be, evolving and moving forward is going to be impossible. What we have to do is yield to the fact that the world is changing on us, and in some positive ways, I mean, notwithstanding COVID, and embrace those changes, and that will help us evolve.
Now, I have a pet theory that I want to run past you, see what you think of it. I argue that far too many Albertans and many of the folks in the oil and gas industry leadership, as well as political leadership, believe that the changes that we're seeing today are really cyclical and not structural. They don't get the point of how quickly clean energy technologies like wind, solar, battery storage, and electric vehicles represent an existential threat to the hydrocarbon sector, because they think that it's just another one of these boom bust cycles. What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I get where they're coming from, but I don't agree with them. I mean, I've been my entire life in Alberta. I've been an economist for 30 years. I understand what cyclical, what cycles are, and I also understand what fundamental change is about. And I'm convinced that what we're seeing around the global economy is a fundamental change in appetite and demand for how we're getting energy. This has been ongoing since the Kyoto Accord, which was in the 90s. This isn't a flash in the pan. And I think if there are any climate change deniers out there, their arguments are becoming weaker and weaker. We have to do something. But the good news for Alberta is I don't think it needs to be either hydrocarbons or renewables. I believe strongly that it needs to be both. But that Alberta, we can leverage all of these really exciting things happening around the world to become a leader in a lot of those clean energy and renewable energy technologies that the world is looking for. This is a great opportunity for us, less than a threat, or more opportunity than a threat.
I couldn't agree more, Todd, and I argue often that when we look at the energy transition, it's both risk mitigation and seizing opportunity. And I'd like to chat with you about that, but before we get to that, I have one other point that I'd like to get your take on, and that is in 2014, 2015, we saw global energy prices, or oil prices, tank because of a 1.5 to 2 million barrel a day oversupply. And I think that COVID-19 has shown that it doesn't take much disruption in markets to create a very significant impact on economies like Alberta. And if we're talking demand destruction for, in the short term, oil, we don't need to take out, 20, 30, 40 million barrels a day of demand out of the market. Two will be fine. Two will have a significant impact. 5 will have an even larger impact on Alberta. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, you raise a really good point. And I should, first of all, make it clear, I'm not an energy analyst or an energy economist, but I do understand when markets are very, very tight, it does not take a huge increase in supply or drop in demand to swing those prices or that balance very quite wildly. And that is what we're seeing. And where oil prices are today, I mean, we're in the middle or maybe even the early stages of the COVID pandemic. We've seen a lot of global oil demand being weakened, but we're also seeing supply constraint. You know, there hasn't been a lot of investment in new energy projects, hydrocarbon projects around the world. So my guess is we are going to remain in that price environment where we're at, but it could swing up or down. And that leaves Alberta always in that precarious situation. We're always at the mercy of what's happening in those global oil markets. And it's time to both embrace the fact that we're a hydrocarbon producer, but do what we can to get off this roller coaster.
That's a very good point, Todd, because there's been a lot of attention paid recently, and I think this is really the direction we need to go. And I'm talking about bitumen beyond combustion, so using bitumen as feedstock for materials production, materials manufacturing like carbon fiber, and using natural gas to make hydrogen, which is I think going to be the biofuel of the future. And while we're doing it, I would argue that we need to do it much, much more quickly than we are because we don't have a lot of time. The window of opportunity is closing here. What's your take on that?
Yeah, especially when you look at hydrogen, other countries around the world, which is ironic because Alberta was maybe one of the early leaders in hydrogen, but other countries around the world have leapfrogged ahead of us. So we are playing catch up. And maybe to your point, we don't have the luxury of saying, let's take our time and over the next 10 years, develop frameworks. And 10 years in the 21st century is 1 year, maybe in the 20th. So we need to be moving very, very quickly on this if we are going to be competitive and if we're going to be at the global table at all.
Now, Todd, this will be the last question. You are an influencer in Alberta. You talk to industry leaders, government leaders, and so on all the time. Based on that experience, kind of what's your sense of how Alberta's leadership, are they waking up to the threat that this poses as well as the opportunities, I suppose?
Well, I mean, I want to remain hopeful on all of this, and I don't take aim at any political party or any government. I mean, this is sort of broadly for all of them. I think they're getting it, but I actually am more confident that the business community has been the one leading the parade. And in many cases, our political leaders are catching up. That said, I'm very encouraged by what I've heard from Alberta's government lately around investments in hydrocarbon, in geothermal, which for years I've been advocating Alberta become a leader in geothermal. So I'm seeing things in positive directions, moving in positive directions. But I think all of us, what we need to do is encourage an even more rapid transition, and our governments will follow. If Albertans want that, that's the direction we'll go.
One final short question, because you are a chief economist for a leading financial institution in Alberta, and it seems to me that the financial community and investors really get this. And are you seeing that reflected in your employer and within the financial community more generally?
I think so. I mean, when we look at investors, especially global investors, there is a lot of caution right now for obvious reasons, especially when we're talking about investing in traditional or even oil sands, traditional hydrocarbons, conventional energy. But I think what Alberta's advantage is that this province was built on very improbable sectors. You know, agriculture wasn't supposed to work here, but we made it work 100 years ago. The oil sands, that's the definition of a marginal resource, but we were able to take technology and smart people and risk takers and make it work. And now in the 21st century, in 2020, I think Alberta is still brimming with people who are, they're bright, they're innovative. And I think that is ultimately what will draw that investment. But right now, I mean, it's, as we're moving through COVID, it's a tough environment, but I do think it'll come back.
Todd, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights. And I'm going to look forward to chatting with you again about these kind of issues in the future.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.